Welcome to Taking the Higher Road, a DriverReach and FreightWaves production. I'm your host, Jeremy Reymer, founder and CEO of DriverReach, a modern recruiting and compliance software solution. On this show, I interview industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insights to the driver lifecycle as we discuss the industry's greatest challenges, driver recruiting, retention, and compliance. I appreciate all the positive feedback on the show. Please remember to rate and review Taking the Higher Road, whatever platform you use to listen. This week, I'm excited to have on the show a great friend of DriverReach, Ron Yazzetti, Vice President of U.S. New Business Sales and Partnerships at Seiza, formerly known as Work4 Labs. Ron comes to us with 20-plus years in recruitment marketing technology with notable success at several large job boards that you may have heard of, like CareerBuilder. So glad to have you back on the show, Ron. Thanks for joining us.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about your background, what attracted you to trucking. I'd love to hear your passion for recruiting technology and the great opportunity that exists when companies embrace that technology. And I'm hoping you can share a little about Seiza and how you're helping companies attract the right types of drivers, and certainly want to unpack some of the results of Seiza's recently released driver survey. I also want to make sure we have some time for a question from a listener during our deeper dive segment. Does all of that work for you?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Well, even before we got started and we were chatting offline here, you referenced some books behind me, and what has become the custom for me is to ask my guests if there's any books maybe that they've read recently or some that have really impacted them that they might recommend for the audience. Anything that comes to mind for you?
That's a really great question. I don't have anything immediate that I would definitely recommend. There's a few that are in my queue. Most of them, fortunately, are in the sales realm, so I don't know how that would be great from a recruiting perspective. But I'm going back to the well and reading some old Brian Tracy books. Just in general, I like from a sales philosophy. I read a lot of kind of different both mindset and sales books, but I would say the biggest one right now is actually not even. I'm trying to think of it. It's actually on my.
Well, here's proof. Well, this is proof that this is not planned. And
you caught me off guard,
right? But you made a comment. You said, "Well, these are sales, so I don't know that it's quite recruiting related." And I would argue that recruiting and sales go hand in hand. And so I do think that there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a collaboration that exists between those who are in sales and the sales mindset and that of a recruiter. So
Brian Tracy is probably one of my top. I think Zig Ziglar and Brian Tracy are two of the most well-known ones. Those I always go back to the well and to read some of their books continuously. But
inspiring,
my recommendation. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Because it's not just about sales; it's about life. And those are great life coaches who I've followed. That because it's one thing to sell something, but to really engage with people and have meaningful conversations like this are really critical. And those books have helped me a lot.
So tell us a bit about you. What, I know you've got a strong background in HR and recruiting technology. What was it that led you to hone in on the trucking industry?
So I started there about 7 years ago. I started actually at Seiza / Work4 about 11 years ago. And what really drew me to the company in general was recruitment marketing on social media. Like you had mentioned, I worked at previous job boards before. So I thought, at the time, Facebook and social media were very innovative. And now they're kind of, standard tools in the arsenal, if you would. But so that's what really got me into that space. And then as I was working with more and more employers, trucking just kept coming up. The demand and need for drivers just was so apparent. And so I took it upon myself about 7 years ago to really hone in on that industry. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert by any means. I'm always learning. But with that being said, I feel like I'm always a student of the industry, if you would. And I haven't driven a truck. In fact, my dad drove a truck for Landstar many years ago. But with that being said, I'm always trying to listen. And I always listen to my employers, trying to see what they're saying about the industry. And that's what really caught me, the transportation space. Just like with HR, I think HR space within transportation is a very niche area. But there's such a great group of people within the industry between you and Wendy. I learned so much and collaborate. But that's really what kind of drove the passion. And I took it upon myself to really hone in on that as an industry, just trying to understand it. The lingo alone is something that takes a while to learn. the difference between, over the road and OTR, local, regional, and the likes. And so owner operator even versus a company driver. So, the more that you learn those things, I'm not afraid to ever say I don't know something. And so always like to ask questions. So that's kind of my background around the history in the space. And it's just really taken off from there. I'd say 90% of the business I speak to are in transportation.
Yeah. And it's hard, once you get in, it's not, I say it's hard, like as if you're trying to escape and you can't. Once you get in and you really dive in, it's you don't want to leave. You find how welcoming and inviting and the industry is, but also the relationships that you can build, and you learn a ton. And by the way, it's I always love to hear somebody who has spent this much time in the industry who says, I'm not an expert. What you really are saying is, because you say that, you're always learning, and it's that humility that's what makes you an expert. That's what gets you there, is because you're continuing to thirst for knowledge to grow and to improve. And so anyway, I think you're an expert, and I want to pick your brain, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So now we know the driver shortage, right? The challenge of finding enough qualified drivers, that's still an ongoing problem, even in today's, softer climate. Your company helps other companies reach more unique and qualified drivers. So for those who aren't familiar with Seiza, can you share some background and how you're helping customers thrive?
Sure. We are basically a recruitment marketing technology company, which means that, if you think about social media, it's a wide landscape. You can do a lot of various things on it, from organic to paid advertising, and we help clients navigate through that. Most of the work that we do centers around the, marketing and advertising side, but, we can definitely give areas of expertise and knowledge and insights into what we see happening on social media in general, or trends. But what we're really trying to do is really trying to leverage those channels to reach audiences of known truck drivers and help them reach qualified applicants that they couldn't reach on their own. And most of the time we are doing that through social sites such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We've done some YouTube advertising, et cetera.
Okay. So social media, it's not a fad. I guess it's here to stay.
It is. It's here. I see your social media posts and, and LinkedIn all the time. So I think everybody has their channels of du jour.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and in our case, I think for drivers, it absolutely makes sense with those that you mentioned, especially, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok and YouTube, obviously. So let's dive into Seiza's recent driver survey report. I know it's chock full of useful data, and maybe let's start peeling that back a little bit. What are some of the key findings or trends that stood out to you? And then let's kind of dive in a little bit. I know there's a number of them, and I don't know that we have enough time to get through all of them. So I will want to encourage our viewers to be able to access that report, and the link will be in the notes. But what are some things that really stand out the most to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I read it through a few times since we last spoke, and basically, there's a couple things that stood out. The biggest thing is really, I don't think there's a disconnect between what I think employers think they're saying to their drivers and what drivers actually are seeing or feeling. And I think that's really important. The big thing that stood out in the survey was how a lot of employers a lot of drivers they feel unwelcomed, or they don't feel like they're part of the company, and they just feel like they're kind of a number in their workforce. So it's really a challenge, I think, because I think employers, the employers that I speak to, they'll tell you they think they're doing a good job. They're working on employment brand, but if you actually listen to the drivers, they also feel like they're not being listened to. So I think that was really a big finding for me. The report itself, I highly recommend anybody listening to the call to spend time. Like you said, I don't think we're really going to be able to do the report justice. There's a lot of data and insight, but just things on what the mindset of the driver, what they're engaged in, what interests them the most. Obviously, pay is very important, but the other thing that stood out was their self-worth, how much they feel they're part of the organization. Home time obviously is very important. So things that would appeal to a potential driver. I think knowing those things are really important, especially if you're thinking about marketing and advertising, right? Because you want to take the input and the insights that you're getting from the report. And I actually challenge everybody on the call, if they're not doing it regularly, to survey their own workforce and see what they want, because that information and insight is invaluable. and they'll be able to take that information and then figure out the best way to advertise. Here at Seiza, we just went from doing annual reviews. In fact, I just got one from my HR person this morning. We're now doing biannual reviews. So I think those constant checkpoints are really helpful. And it was apparent to me, perhaps in the data and the report, that I don't think employers are probably doing that or asking their workforce their feelings.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things I'd like to add there, because first of all, what you're saying is get feedback from your people. What matters to them? Getting that feedback, that's a retention strategy, obviously, especially when you get that feedback, you solicit it, and then you actually do something about it and you communicate what you're doing about it. Our really good friend, Max Farrell at Workhound, preaches this constantly as a great product and as a great partner. But beyond that, it's also important for your, kind of to what you described, is to be able to use that intel to help, attract and get your messaging kind of more on point. And what's funny is I have been part of ATRI's research advisory committee for two separate stints of 2 years each. So for a total of 4 years. And every year, if you're familiar with ATRI, they put out an annual top 10 industry issues survey, and they survey drivers as well as carriers. And what's amazing is the disparity between what the carriers are saying that matter, their top 10 issues, and what drivers are saying. And the carriers issue is always driver shortage, concerns about hiring. And the what's funny is, you're like, if that is the case, then everything over here you should be paying attention to, and the things that matter to them. And that's kind of what you're talking about here with the survey that you've put out. You're getting all this really good feedback. Okay, this is great stuff. Now, what are we going to do about it?
Absolutely. And some of the stuff's obvious. So one of the things you said is what I learned, but obviously pay and home time came up numerous times throughout the survey, right? So people want to be paid more. I think that's natural. I don't think that's specific to the transportation industry, right? But with that being said, what was really interesting was we asked a question that was related to what would make them leave or what would make them stay. And the answers to that, of course, believe it or not, the answer that outweighed even pay was being heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was huge, is that even if the person was not necessarily happy with the compensation, they would still stick around if they felt like they were being listened to and paid attention to. So I think that's really important.
Well, and how much does that cost?
Zero.
That's the point, right?
Time and effort. Yeah. I mean, time and effort.
And so, I mean, for anybody on the, in the financial world that's here, I mean, just listen, and, kind of give that time, give that attention. It doesn't necessarily have to turn into an increase in compensation, but it's that sense and feeling of inclusion, involvement, of being heard. So, excellent point. Go ahead.
Well, I had one more point before I lost.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So, we're talking about social media advertising, right? I came from the job board space where it was very linear. Person applied to an ad and they sent over their information, and then you follow up with them. What's interesting with social media, whether it's paid or organic, this is another important part around this kind of survey and constant feedback loop is, when you're posting these ads, people can comment, people can like, share, etc. And a lot of times companies, particularly carriers, are very concerned over what may or may not be posted or shared about them. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's the wrong lens to look through things, because when I look at that as just a constant survey. So they're constantly getting feedback from their ad, their compensation, their pay, their benefits. And, don't shy away from the fact when they say, hey, I think you guys are paying too less. Listen to that, right? There could be some validity to it. There obviously could just be people disgruntled, but for the most part, listen to what the potential job seekers are saying about the content in the job that you're posting.
Well, and a couple of things on that note. There are, it's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, social media in general, open forums like that, everybody has a microphone now, and we all know not everybody should, but everybody does. And that being said, there are going to be things that are said about a carrier that are not flattering, and sometimes, probably a lot of times, they're not even true, but somebody's spiteful, and so I think it's important to be fully transparent, is to allow that sort of dialogue to exist, as long as it's professional. If it goes over a line, then that's a whole nother thing. But then how you engage with that says as much about who you are as a company than what that comment might be.
Huge. Absolutely. You at that point, you're showing that you're caring about your drivers. And that's kind of the point. There's only one time that I think that I had an instance where I couldn't really help the client. They were moving animal waste product, and there was kind of a spill that happened for them, unfortunately, and it became very negative press. And so that was something that was like, you know what, maybe you need to take a break and from social media, and then come back to it perhaps when you have a different story to tell. So
yeah, I mean, it's a tool, but again, I think it can be a double-edged sword. But I think when you embrace it, that's what people. You mentioned our involvement with LinkedIn, I think, and they say, "Well, I see you everywhere." Well, the reality is, you just have to be consistent with it. That's something too that we tried that, it didn't work, and you're the one talking to some of these folks. It's like, you got to be consistent with it. You have to keep doing it. In terms of recruitment, you mentioned the importance of like content and messaging and getting that feedback, and then kind of crafting that. How can companies maybe more effectively craft their message to attract and retain drivers? Any specific strategies or best practices that you might point out?
Really, really good point. Obviously, short and to the point is the general mantra, right? You want to have, especially in social media, you want to get your message across briefly, and that not only is in written format, but also video too, right? If you're doing TikTok and Instagram, those videos clips have to be relatively short, or else you're going to lose attention. Even YouTube ads. As far as content goes, I am under the premise of always go with the data, right? So part of the data in the report actually talked a lot about what drivers would respond to, and things like, you could take the same compensation rate and break it out to either no compensation or weekly, annually, or cents per mile as an example. And certain of those key attributes are going to perform better than others. For example, weekly and annual pay scale performs a lot better. CPM is terrible. It actually, at least on social media, it doesn't work very well at all. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into CPM. And so I think drivers are kind of put off for it. Believe it or not, sign-on bonuses, not in favor at all. So we've kind of recommend clients kind of remove those. So these are just things that not necessarily that whatever you pay is what you pay, but where that sits in the posting, making sure compensation is front and center, because we know pay is really important for the driver. That's what's going to give you a better result. I have a lot of drivers that are like, well, I don't want to mention the pay because people are going to be upset. Well, there's two thoughts of that. One, if you're disclosing it, at least people are going to know it, and then you're not going to have attrition in the back end. Or, maybe you need to think about your pay scale. Are you really under industry average?
Well, and that's an excellent point on the cents per mile conversation, because that all depends on how many miles you drive. So that means nothing. Otherwise, it's a vanity metric. What really matters to the driver is not what my cents per mile is. It matters, how much money am I going to be able to make here? Does that meet my needs?
Yep. And you can, the other tip that I'll give here is that you can offer that there's different ways that you can list the pay, right? So you can have starting at, up to, or a range. And we've had success with all, but a lot of it obviously depends on what your compensation truly is. You can use averages, you can use ranges. So just think in those terms. Don't be afraid to list pay. Just think about how you can be truthful in the way you present it and what might work best for you. And a lot of times we're helping guide our clients. That is one of the values that we bring to the table, of course, is we're doing these surveys. We're speaking to a lot of clients, and I got a good feel for the markets. We're able to give our clients that expertise.
Yeah, well, and that's huge, because quite honestly, a lot of fleets, especially some of the more smaller, medium size, this is not their area of expertise. They may be really good at, maintaining equipment, or they have some really good relationships with shippers and, but how this lane, like all of those things, but they're maybe not really good at marketing. They're not really good at recruiting or hiring. And so from that perspective, partnering with companies like you, it makes a lot of sense. What are you, as a prognosticator, how do you envision, or what do you envision as the future of the industry, particularly in relation to recruitment and retention, or any emerging trends or technologies that could impact this area?
Yeah, I think one thing that came up in the report that stood out was it talked about which form of communication that job seekers want to be most engaged with. And so the answers were phone call, email, or SMS message. And last year, it was email messaging was actually the most preferred. And this year, it was actually the least preferred. But one thing that grew the most was definitely SMS. So one of the biggest trends that we're definitely seeing is the need for more SMS messaging with prospects, and also the automation of those efforts. So sequencing, I think you guys offer, the ability to do those things. And I think those are really imperative as an employer. And I don't necessarily believe that employers are doing it enough or doing it in the right fashion. So the same thing with your advertising efforts, think about your outreach efforts to those prospects the same. Strategically use math, use analytics and statistics to figure out, what's the best approach, when's the best time to reach them, what channels should I be using, what should I be saying, how often should I be reaching them? So all those topics are, I think, very important. You talked about the transition or crossover between sales and recruiting, and we think about those things a lot on the sales side as well. What's the best way to reach our prospects? Where should we be reaching them? How often we should be reaching them? So I think thinking analytically that way more and more is really a trend, and using automation, AI obviously is a huge trend across multiple industries.
Yeah, I've not heard of that. Is that a new thing that's kind of
new fad? There you go. But it's here to stay. And one thing that I'm seeing on it, because we're presently in the market of sales tools and resources, and so I was very astute to some of the technology there that could be interesting for the HR world. And one tool that I saw a lot of is integrating ChatGPT into messaging for sales purposes. So you can ask ChatGPT anything, and you can kind of create your own content. But a lot of these new tools on the sales side and the messaging side are actually creating ChatGPT type technology into the platforms to help give text recommendations based on those performance metrics that we talked about.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. And as soon as you said AI, and I immediately thought, ChatGPT is coming after me. I'm going to be replaced on this show. Hopefully not.
I think that's possible, but yes, in theory, perhaps.
So
have you seen those? Because you could obviously have a rendering, and there's been renderings of videos of human beings that everything's automated, and so you in theory could have yourself as kind of a character, and then you have ChatGPT feeding the answers. So.
Well, I don't know if you're old enough.
Real.
Well, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Max Headroom, but
I did. Yeah.
We're just finally that's coming to fruition. Those people were prescient in the mid '80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I forgot about that. Yeah.
So we do have time for our deeper dive question. So quickly, this is a question from one of our listeners, and the question is: how is social media and video evolving? Are these still relevant ways to invest in driver recruitment? I know we touched on that, but
sure.
Thoughts on that?
I mean, they're here to stay, right? In the past, there's been some platforms that have come and gone, and for example, Google Plus is an example. So back when Facebook was the ultimate king, there were some platforms that were out there, but Twitter's been out just as long. They're still here. Elon Musk obviously thought it was very important for him to invest a ton of money into it. So clearly he saw some value in that. And, TikTok is still here to stay. So I think these platforms are here to stay. I just think of them as like modern day television, right? If you think about television, you have all these different channels and audiences that they're trying to appeal to. I think you'll look at perhaps TikTok kind of the same way, or social media the same way. It's like you pick and choose where your audiences are going to be. We talked a lot about, LinkedIn, of course, being kind of quarter professional. And then you have some of these other channels that might be more catered towards entry level workforce folks. So I think that's the way you should think about them. But I don't see any envisionment unless the government steps in. But I don't see any chance in the near term that any of the ones that we mentioned are going away.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you even mentioned Google Plus, because, I remember when that came about, and this is going to have legs. It's Google.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they poured, millions upon millions of dollars, probably hundreds of millions before they decided to pull that plug. But,
well, that's an interesting point, because one of the things I'll say that we're seeing in social media as far as trends goes is back when I was still at Seiza at that time, formerly Work4, but Google Plus, everybody was asking, what can you do on Google Plus? Are you guys building on top of Google Plus? And at the time, we were really reluctant to do so. We never really built anything on top of the platform, thankfully. But, nowadays, you think about it, there's all these other channels that exist, and you still have, you're in technology development as well. Anytime you build something, you want to make sure that it's got potential and future value. And I think that's possible today. And up until about a year ago, even with TikTok, for example, it was very difficult to do recruitment related things. Twitter was never really, you could blast a lot of content on Twitter and jobs and stuff, and that was a thing, but I think that's kind of went away. But these platforms are being great places to engage with your audiences. So having like a cohesive strategy of both organic posting and then obviously doing advertising is what we would recommend. But these channels, I think, are more primed to do recruitment than they ever have been. It's took a couple of years to get there, but I think they're definitely more right.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm grateful for our relationship, our partnership, and appreciate your dedication and expertise in the industry.
I appreciate that. I'm humbled. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Jeremy.
And thanks for joining me for another episode of Taking the High Road and for spreading the word to your industry peers. We really appreciate it. And remember, you could submit any questions or comments, including those which may appear on upcoming Deeper Dive segments at podcast@driverreach.com. And don't forget to rate and review Taking the Higher Road, whatever platform you use to listen. Until next time, thank you for taking the higher road.